One of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And so it's really tyrannical, but at the same time it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant or the bad tyrant and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist, and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie. Because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. And if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat, and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp, and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant, and let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stellan surrounded by what is for all intents and purposes fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way. So, you know, this is another example of the tyrannical element of the Great Father and the sorts of things that can happen. I mean, I kind of got an evil kick out of this ad that was quite old. You know, it's kitschy in some sense, and you know, it shows. I don't think that's something you'd ever see in a magazine today. 10 unusual stamps showing evil dictator. You know, well, fair enough. I mean, that's what he was, and that's the consequence, and that's just a tiny bit of the consequence, because the Nazis wiped out a very large number of people, often using compassion as a justification. So when they went after the mentally ill and the terminally ill, and those whose intelligence was compromised for biological reasons, and those who were too old, they basically justified it by saying that the enforced euthanasia was merciful, and that you were actually being a good person by complying with the requirements. And so, something to think about. More mythological representations, I like these quite a bit. So there's there Hitler as, you know, knight of the faith, essentially, with, I suppose that's a recreation of the Christian Holy Spirit dove, you know, except it's an eagle, which is a bird of prey, and a what do you call those things, a scavenger, right? So that's kind of interesting. But that's Hitler as knight of the blood, roughly speaking. And this is an Allied war poster, essentially, that assimilates the Nazis to poisonous snakes. And you know, we don't like poisonous snakes very much, and it's probably because they've been preying on us for approximately 20 million years, because snakes and primates, humans in particular, co-evolved. And so the snake is a representation of that which lies outside the comfortable domain, and that can be, you know, a snake, obviously, or it can be an abstract snake, and the abstract snake is your enemy, or an even more abstract snake is the evil in your own heart. And this is going to be a bit of a leap for you, but there's this ancient idea that developed in the West over thousands of years, far predating Christianity, that, at least its origins, that the snake in the Garden of Eden was also Satan, which is like what the hell, it's a very strange idea. But the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is that, you know, we have this circuitry that detects predators, and a good representation of a predator is a snake, or a monster that incorporates snake-like features, like a dragon or something like that, or a dinosaur with lots of teeth, or a shark that lives under the water and will pull you down. You know, because I suspect a lot of our ancestors met a nasty death at the hands of Nile crocodiles while they were in the African veldt going down to get some nice water. So, you know, that's the thing that jumps up and pulls you under, and, you know, and that happens in your own life because things jump up and pull you under, you know, and you use the same circuitry. We use the same circuitry to process unknown things that upset us, as we once used to detect predators who were likely to invade our space. And so, and human beings are capable of abstraction, and so, you know, you could think about the real predator that might invade your space, and maybe that's a snake or a wolf or some kind of monster. You know, and that's pretty concrete and biological. Chimps have that, you know, chimps don't like snakes, and so if a chimp comes across a snake in the wild, then like a big, let's say, I don't know what live with chimps. I don't know if they're pythons, but they have constrictors there anyways. So, you know, maybe there's like a 20-foot constrictor and the chimp like stays a good distance away from it, but it won't leave, and then it has this particular cry that it utters that's called a snake raa, W-R-A-A, and so it makes this noise, which means something like, holy shit, that's a big snake. And I actually mean that because the circuits that primates use to utter distress calls are the same circuits that we use to curse. Just so you know, that's why people with Tourette syndrome swear, because like, what's up with that? How can you have a neurological condition that makes you swear? Well, it turns out that guttural, affect-laden curses are mediated by a different speech circuit, and that's the speech circuit we share with the predator alarms of other primates. So that's pretty cool. So anyways, the chimp stands there and makes this snake noise, and then a bunch of other chimps come running, and you know, some of them stay a fair ways from the snake and some of them get pretty close, but they'll stand there and watch that snake for like 24 hours, you know, so they're fascinated by it. And you know, if you've handled snakes, you can understand that fascination because they're fascinating, you know, and they're numinous. I would say that's the right way of putting it. A numinous is a word that means intrinsically meaningful, like a fire, you know. You can't look away from fire, you know, if you're sitting in front of a fireplace, it's like you're staring at it. And that's because you're all descended from the first mad chimpanzee who had some weird genetic mutation that made it impossible for him to stay away from fire. It was like the first chimp arsonist, you know, and he figured it out, and well, hey, now he was a chimp with a stick with fire on it. Like, that's a mega chimp, man. And so, you know, we have that mutation in spades, and no wonder. So anyways, so they make this, you know, they have this reaction to snakes, and chimps that have never seen a snake, if they're in a cage and you throw a rubber snake in there, it's like bang, they hit the roof, but then they look at the snake, you know. So it's like, it's terrifying and fascinating at the same time. And you should look at the snake because you want to know what it does, but you should stay away from it because it's a snake. So you're kind of screwed in terms of your motivations, right? One is get the hell away, and the other is, well, don't let that thing do anything that you're not watching. And so that's really the reaction we have to the unknown. It's terrifying, but we watch it. And then, you know, the meta story is that not only do we watch it, but we go explore it. And so you might think, well, back in the Garden of Eden, so to speak, when we were living in trees, the snakes used to come and eat us and our offspring, more likely. And, you know, we weren't very happy about that. And then we figured out how to maybe by accident drop a stick on a snake. And that was a good thing because the snake didn't like that. And then maybe the next thing we learned a little later was to like actually take a stick and like whack the snake with it. And you can believe that the first primate who figured out that was just as popular as the guy who mastered fire. And so we're pretty good at whacking snakes with sticks, which is why Springfield has a snake whacking day that's devoted to nothing but that. Right, I don't know if you know that Simpsons episode, but it's quite comical. So, well, so then you think about the snake as a predator, and it's the thing that invades the garden always, because you just can't keep snakes out of the damn garden no matter how hard you try. And then you think of snakes, and maybe you think of meta snakes, and like a meta snake would be also a predator, but maybe that's the predator that represents the destructive spirit of the other tribe, because chimpanzees, for example, are quite tribal and they definitely go to war with one another. And so you think, you abstract out the idea of the predator to represent malevolence as such, and then you take that one step further and you realize that the worst of all evil predators is the human capacity for evil. And then at that point, you know, you're starting to, I would say, psychologize or spiritualize the idea of danger and make it into something that's conceptual and something that's psychological and something that you can face sort of en masse. I mean, one of the things people had to figure out was, how do you deal with danger? and so you figure out how you deal with a specific danger. But then because human beings are so damn smart, they thought, well, what if we considered the class of all dangerous things? And then what if we considered a mode of being that was the best mode of being in the face of the class of all dangerous things? Well, that's a lot better. You get to solve all the dangerous problems all at once, instead of having to conjure up a different solution for every dangerous thing. And that's basically, as far as I can tell, where the hero story came from. And the hero story is basically, there's a community, it's threatened by the emergence of some old evil, often represented by a dragon. That's sort of typical, say, of the Lord of the Rings stories. There's a hero, often a humble guy, but not always, sometimes a knight, decides he'll go out there, and chase down the snake, maybe even, or the serpent, or the dragon, maybe even in its lair, and he'll have a bunch of adventures on the way that transform him from, useless, naive hobbit into, sword-wielding hero, and he confronts the dragon and gets the gold and frees the people that it had enslaved, and then comes back transformed to share what he's learned with the community. It's like, well, that's the human story fundamentally, and that's our basic instinctive pattern, and it's represented in narratives constantly. And that's partly what this has meaning. You know what this means. Why do you know? Well, because it draws on symbolic representations that you already understand. You understand that a mess of toothed snakes is not a good thing, and that maybe the sensible thing to do is stomp them. And it's not like you need an instruction manual to figure out what the poster means. And so, that's two different representations of Hitler. That's sort of the pro-Hitler representation, and I would say that's the anti-Hitler representation. And that's the real Hitler, who at this point does not look like a very happy clam. So